the quality that has overwhelmed me all these years was Srila Prabhupada's inconceivable humility. Because he had that, that disarmed all of my anarthas and maya to the point that I could sincerely ask him the question. At first I raised my hand and he wouldn't take it. And then I raised my hand. He would wait until somebody else in the room raised their hand. Then he would take their hand. He would ignore my hand. 3 or 4 times like this. And I was rephrasing my question in my mind. Then I asked my question. And I closed my eyes and I said, Sri Bhaktivedanta Swami. And that was the moment right there. Because in that moment, when I said his name is actually the answer to my question before I even asked it. My question was, how is it that this universal presence, which is humanly inconceivable, to me at least at this time, how can it have this form of Radha and Krishna? So Srila Prabhupada, his very name is the answer to that question. He is Bhakti Vedanta. He is the end of knowledge, is Bhakti Yoga and devotion to Krishna. And so Srila Prabhupada, for a moment there, I just became disoriented. I said his name and I couldn't even go on with the question. And Srila Prabhupada very, very patiently waited for me. Everybody waited for me. It was a very intense moment because his glance was upon me and his mercy was upon me. So then he answered me. He said, by his mercy. And then he said something very astounding, for which was one of the main reasons that, it was a mystical thing, but it was one of the reasons that broke through my hippie anarthas or whatever I had, so that I joined. Srila Prabhupada said, you cannot make the sun rise. These are in my own words. It's in the folio much more eloquently. And similarly, you cannot make God appear before you just to answer your doubts. So what had happened was 6 months before, I had been sitting on the edge of a cliff after climbing a mountain all night long. And I was going to meditate on Om, and then when the sun rose, I was going to merge with the sun. I was going to become one with the one at that time. And Srila Prabhupada said, you cannot, and when the sun rose, after all this endeavor, I'd been fasting for days, and I'm sitting out here, I climbed all night long this mountain. When the sun rose, it was a cloudy day, and I couldn't even see the sun. So Srila Prabhupada says, you cannot make the sun rise, and similarly, you cannot make God appear before you just to answer your doubts. And the night before I had come to Krishna consciousness, I had prayed to Krishna, to a deity of Lord Shiva, to please help me to know what was the answer of, for everything. And then here the next day I meet Srila Prabhupada. It was so wonderful how everything happened.
So I joined the Chicago Temple in 1972, just before Janmashtami and Vyas Puja, knowing that the devotees were all going to pile in a van and go to the big festival in New Vrindavan. So they just buzzed me up, and I went there, and we were just, all ecstatic. You're a new devotee, you were ecstatic. Prabhupada's coming. And I remember when Srila Prabhupada pulled up in the car and got out, I could feel it. It felt like in every molecule of my body, I could feel that I had been traveling all over the material universe, the higher planets, the middle planets, the lower planets, for millions and millions of lifetimes. I could just feel it. It wasn't like theoretical. I could feel it. And there he was. There he was. This was my ticket out. This was the person. My sojourn in the material world was over. And I can remember just being in complete ecstasy. My hairs were standing on end, and I was just crying like anything. And I can't even remember if I paid my obeisances. I was so stunned and bowled over, and just a feeling, such a great feeling of relief that my sojourn in the material world was over. All I had to do was follow Srila Prabhupada, and everything had been taken care of.
We were walking in Regent's Park in London with Srila Prabhupada. And actually it was perhaps the month of October or November. It was quite cold. And there had been some type of precipitation because the walkway was icy. Prabhupada had on a airline blanket which he was using to wrap around his waist on top of his dhoti. I'm sure Prabhupada didn't steal the blanket from the airline, but somebody did. In any case, it was a type of striped blanket of some type. I believe it was striped. I forget the airline. And there was a wool blanket. He would wear that. And it was just Srila Prabhupada and myself walking. And as we were walking through the park, Prabhupada was taking his stick, and he would stop and he would smack the puddle which had frozen. Then he would walk on. Then he'd come to the next one and he'd bang, smack it, and it would shatter. And after a while, I guess he was waiting for me to ask him why he was doing that. So I asked him. And Prabhupada said, because this is not the natural condition of the water. He said, similarly, it is not our nature to be in Maya. So we must break the back, the material energy. And he said, this is not our natural condition, to be in Maya. And I remember we kept walking, and at one point there were some, I think it was some, he noticed that there was a lake of some type, and it was frozen except for the portion around the trees. And he said the Goswamis knew this secret. That's why they lived under trees. He said because a tree is warm in the winter, underneath the tree is warm in the winter and cool in the summer. He said you can see that because around the tree the water is not frozen.
Whenever Prabhupada would come back to America from foreign countries, I remember many times he would have a press conference, and he would always declare to the reporters, these are American boys and girls, I've not imported them from India. It was very important for Prabhupada to show that Krishna consciousness was being accepted by the people of that country. Similarly, one time, a GBC representative sent Prabhupada a picture of a new castle that had been rented in Geneva, Switzerland. And outside the castle, there were about 30 devotees in a group photograph. He sent this to Prabhupada, a big glossy picture. Prabhupada wrote back and said, it's very nice, but I have one question. Are these local devotees, or have you brought them from somewhere else? So, of course, this is not specifically on the topic of analogy, but it shows how Prabhupada was very concerned that the local people in each place actually understand Krishna consciousness. For example, when Prabhupada went to Nairobi, when Africa was just being opened, and I remember one lecture he gave in which he urged the people not to follow the false example of the so-called developed countries. And he gave a special lecture for those people in a third world country in Africa that they should pursue another line of development according to Krishna consciousness. So this, I think, is something that can be discussed also, is how Prabhupada in so many different countries presented something which was very appropriate and meaningful to the people of that country. For example, in America, he, knowing that Americans would naturally be proud of having the most important, materially most important country, he would sometimes praise. He simultaneously praised America and pointed out the flaw by saying that you have so many achievements, but all these achievements are like zeros. The fine roads, the buildings, the prosperity. They are material achievements, but they're also zeros. But if you put the one of Krishna in front of the zeros, then these achievements become real achievements. So that was preaching for America.